Hello, friends. Welcome back. It's Alfie Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. This is our first recording of the year, so welcome 2021. So nice to see you, and so nice to see fellow Bungers Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare. Hi, guys.
Hey, how's it going?
I was going to say Happy New Year, but just New Year,
Just
I think
a
is
statement.
sufficient.
Just
don't need
it
the
is a
happy
new
bit.
year. Yeah.
Yeah, my enthusiasm was definitely forced, given that it's lockdown number 3 here.
Yeah.
You're pulling back the curtain pretty quickly there.
Come on, let's keep spirits up, guys. Let's at least
energy.
end. Yeah. So anyway, I'm Alex Hochuli, and this is meant to be a Biden administration preview. But some things happened. Some things happened yesterday. Today's Thursday, the 7th of January. And some things happened yesterday, I'm sure you'll know. And we're going to talk about those things first. And then we're also going to do the promised Biden administration preview. And we're joined by Amber Lee Frost and Daniel Bessner to do just that, who'll be on the line in just a second. But I'm actually just looking at the news, and I seen that Chuck Schumer had called for the president's removal as several administration officials resign in protest. It's amazing. It's like completely farcical. It's like just unable to hold things together just for the last couple of weeks.
They almost made it to the end, but
almost made it to the end as friends, but
didn't quite happen.
The whole thing is fairly extraordinary, and I suppose, we'll get into this in more detail when we have our guests on. But everything about it is so strange and so difficult to get a fix on, I think, as well. And I think probably the best thing I've read so far, is probably Mike Davis's take on the New Left Review blog, where he says something about its surreal quality. And he quotes the surrealists when they say the condition of inclusion in their surreal kind of ventures in surreal cinema and what have you was that it would not be explicable by rational me. Any kind of rational way of understanding things wouldn't work. And I think that also fits like the everything that we've seen in the last 24 hours on Capitol Hill. The bizarreness, the incongruence, the incoherence, the lack of any the lack of fit with any kind of easy narrative, the confusion, all of it is genuinely incoherent. And I think that's probably an important takeaway. It is what it looks like.
Yeah, no, I mean, my mentions have either been going, because I wrote this thing about, which came out a month ago, saying, when Trump peacefully leaves office next month, blah, 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 and, Trump's not a fascist, and our fantasies of fascism serve to discipline the left more than anything else. Anyway, people kind of responding, how did that take hold up? Ha 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 ha. Obviously, see, Trump really is trying to do a coup. And other people going, no, actually that has held up. So, we'll let listeners decide, because I'm sure we'll be talking with Amber and Daniel about these narratives of coup, of fascism, and so on, before we get on to some of the stuff about who Biden's brought in and whatnot, and what to look forward to over the next 4 years.
I don't think anybody seriously thinks it's a coup. I mean,
well,
be pretty disingenuous.
They think it's an attempt. No, an attempt. People think it's a coup
yeah.
attempt. Yeah.
People do seriously think that. Why do you mean I don't think people seriously think that? Why would you say that?
Because it's obviously not.
Yeah,
and I'm not saying
that's the problem with society.
Anymore,
that's the problem with society, that certain people think other things which are different to yours, and you can't believe how they think that. It's hard to get your head around.
I should say I haven't been on Twitter so I'm just kind of, I guess, projecting what quote unquote normal people think, not what people on Twitter say that they think or tweet about. So
basically, you're representing the man in the street here on the podcast.
Well, there are no people in the streets; they're all under house arrest, locked down at home. But yeah, that's the constituency I'm representing. Just straight thinking, straight talking.
Yeah,
But I mean, yeah, we I guess we can see what the what work that narrative's doing, and who's putting that forward, whether seriously or not.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's get Amber and Daniel on the line and talk about this in more depth. Okay, hello, this is Alex Hochuli, Philip Cunliffe, and George Hoare, and we are joined by Daniel Bessner and Amber Lee Frost. Hi, guys. If you can all say hello in unison.
Hi, how you doing?
Oh, nearly.
I had to unmute myself. Because we're such a crowd. We're such a boisterous crowd here.
Yeah, wild stuff going on.
Almost like an insurrection.
There are a dime a dozen these days, insurrections. You know, when Glenn Beck talked about a coming insurrection, little did he know. There'd be all sorts of insurrections, even insurrections on his team. Maybe that's where we should start, actually. How significant do you think yesterday's insurrection that wasn't was? What is your take on it, Daniel?
Sure. I'll start off. Well, I think I guess to give the disclaimer, it was obviously bad to have a bunch of racist Trump people storming the Capitol. But I think that the initial response on the liberal side and the left has been very disconcerting to me, and that's really to call it a coup. And then I don't want to get into the type of conversation which is very similar to the fascism conversation, which eventually someone picks their favorite theorist and you go through the checklist theory of fascism or the checklist theory of the coup, which is, did it fulfill this blah, 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 blah. To me, it's more a question of political strategy and more a question of identifying what actually happened so that our analysis will be better in order to prevent, or to prevent the social forces that represented from coming to power or gaining more power or whatever it may have you. And to me, this was not a coup by any stretch, by any definition. And the only thing that we gain by calling it a coup is to give a logic to an ever more powerful American security state, which is looking for any excuse whatsoever to increase its surveillance authorities, to erode our already eroded civil liberties. And one thing that will happen, which is what will absolutely happen if the security state, if liberals who bolster the state refer to this as a coup and successfully define it as a coup, is not only will this state be empowered, as it always is and has been for centuries, and especially over the last 20 years, but the people who will suffer are going to be the poor and the left and Black Americans, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very disappointed or not willing or whatever to that people are so quick to embrace a security logic that has been so disastrous in both the United States and abroad. And I think this is playing into the hands of the liberals who are about to govern. Maybe if Bernie Sanders or someone else and I was going to be on the NSC, feel free to call it a coup, but who's actually going to be in power is going to be Joe Biden. And Joe Biden and the people who are going to appoint are going to be looking for any excuse to increase their power, to increase their authority, and will do nothing to erode these already very empowered security state apparatuses. And that's why I think it's really important that we actually define what we mean by what a coup is, and why I think it's damaging to refer to it as a coup.
Yeah, I mean, this was never, I don't think there was any prospect of the security forces going over to Trump's side and sustaining his cause and holding up his claims and therefore overturning the election, right? I mean,
just want to underline this is very important because Jim Mattis, who was Trump's Secretary of Defense, but more importantly, Jim Mattis is a very, very respected military figure. Over the last 20 years, he's been behind some of the most important military developments in American history. And Jim Mattis came out in public basically lambasting Trump. And I think that's critical because Mattis, from what I can tell, speaking on behalf of the uniformed military. Of course, the American military is not allowed to literally talk about politics. It can't make political choices, even though everything they do is profoundly political. So when Mattis is talking and he's going against Trump, he's actually saying the military will not only not support Trump, but the military is going to be on the side of the incoming state. So it was never a coup. Coup we could get into the definitions if you wanted, but requires winning over police power, requires winning over the military power, requires things like arresting your political opponents and exiling them or murdering them, requires having a plan to install ministers. And this was not a coup. It wasn't a cap putsch. It wasn't even a beer hall putsch. And I think it's important to actually recognize what real coup looked like.
Amber, you dissent from that at all? I mean, and actually one of the interesting things...
Unfortunately, Danny and I are very much in lockstep on this particular point. So we'll both be executed by the liberals together. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's important to realize that this was plain in terms of protest, but spontaneous in terms of execution. I think that because liberals in particular, or even like leftists really at this point, have this relationship to protest where they think that absolutely any activity indicates, coordinated life. They're like, this was a coup, because that's also how they think of themselves. Whenever there's whenever protesters or whatever set a cop car on fire, they're like, yeah, and it's like, okay, this is like, this is mistaking the kind of like libidinal impulses of a riot for a coordinated and organized paramilitary group or occupation or something sustainable. That said, I do find it a bit disturbing. I'll go ahead and say that. Just to not echo Danny entirely, but one of the things that disturbed me more completely was the fact that they seemed totally unprepared for this level of, we'll say, activity at the Capitol, which either means that all of the histrionic kind of screaming about Trump being a fascist and his supporters being brown shirts, they never actually believed because they weren't preparing for it, and this, whatever is conspiratorial, or they anticipated that happening and thought it might make good TV. No, I don't think they wanted it to go as far as it did, but I think they very much benefit from, let's say, the deplorables in their casting getting a lot of screen time. And I think, as Danny said, this will definitely provide a rather convenient sort of boogeyman for, Trump or Harris or whoever have their hands up either of their asses like a Muppet to say, look, we have to, institute this kind of policy. We have to institute more observation. We have to crack down on protests. We have to whatever. Because we're protecting you from fascists. There's almost a fascist coup. We're doing this for you. We're taking care of you. Don't you know that those horrible racists are, planning a coup again in the basement of an Aryan bookshop? So that's really what disturbs me, I think, most of all. The other thing, and I'd say that's tied for the fact that I think the Democrats are actually set on antagonizing these people. To the point where it is dangerous. It's very clear to me that there was no interest in de-escalation whatsoever. I was watching CNN and sort of flipping between that and MSNBC and Fox News when it was going on. There was a clip of Anderson Cooper saying these people, he said something like he kept trying to privilege shame them. It was really strange. He kept saying that they were nothing like any of the Americans throughout history who had been denied their rights, who had genuine complaints, and these people are just going to go back to their Holiday Inns and go back to Olive Garden after this. And it was like, wow, you know what? I don't know how you did this, but somehow I hate you more than anyone at the Capitol right now. I think they're hell bent on really, really drawing out this antagonism for spectacle, and I think they don't realize that it's actually really difficult to demonize such a chaotic group of people without it getting out of hand and people eventually siding with them, because guess what? They fucking shot a woman to death.
And what's really what's kind of ironic about the whole thing is that Trump, the kind of would-be fascist dictator, has had so many opportunities for his Reichstag fire moments, given emergency, the emergency context of the global pandemic and what have you, and he's never been able or willing to take them. Whereas it seems like, this effectively could well be, as Amber indicates, this could be like a mini Reichstag fire moment instead for the Democrats, that they will, they've got the kind of the will, the organization and the majorities now to be able to exploit this kind of the shambolic outcome of chip away or chisel away even more at civil liberties and to generally enhance the authoritarian power of the U.S. state, as Danny said. There is one thing which I think is kind of so one thing I would say about it, which I think is kind of extraordinary, is the kind of just the theatre of it is so strange and unusual and difficult to process. So aside from the kind of, what the demographic is, and precisely how they, whether or not the security was sufficient and how they managed to get past security and all of that, what's striking about me is it seems like the shock with which it's been received and the way in which, I think it was George Bush, the former president, said, like, this is what happens in a banana republic. Just the shambolic character of it all, it seems to me that is kind of politically significant insofar as it's, the most hallowed site of the U.S. Republic has been desecrated by this carnivalesque spectacle. And that seems to me to be important for how we understand, or how everyone in the world, in fact, will understand the nature of U.S. authority. And if people are less confident that the U.S. can be looked up to as the kind of paradigm of political probity and authority, then that sounds to me probably like a good thing to come out of all of this.
Yeah. So that's just very quickly, that's a really interesting thing, because one of the things that I've been focusing on in the last year or two is just what happens when, I think you're right, the U.S. is shorn or whatever little moral authority it had after Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. I think that's right. I think that's clearly happening. I mean, you have, for example, just to take the most obvious things, like people like Trudeau or Johnson or Merkel publicly insulting Trump, right? And I think everyone pretty much recognizes that Biden's kind of an empty suit, and it'll be interesting to see who he points, and we'll talk about that soon. But what happens when that sort of moral legitimacy is totally absent and still basically world historical, potentially world destroying empire? Because I don't think the apparatuses of the American military state are in any way weaker than they've ever been. I think they're still extremely powerful. And the United States could still invade and destroy other countries. You don't even need to rely on mass armies anymore. It's not the 17th century, right? You could, with actually a very small use of force, really annihilate countries around the world. So you have this strange situation where you have total imperial hegemonic power still extant. And I think that's still true with regards to China, although people might disagree, with a totally illegitimate state, both at home and abroad. And I think it's a really interesting situation that we haven't quite seen in modernity.
George?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Yeah. I think that kind of, and maybe I think perhaps there's no other point at which you've had that much of a disconnect between the scale of power that's available to the U.S. state, and at the same time, it's like you said, Danny, the relative lack of authority both at home and abroad.
I mean, that's going to be a challenge for the Dems to kind of create this narrative that this is the end of Trumpism. This is what Biden's saved, not just America but the whole world from. And yeah, I mean, it is an undermining massively of American authority to see this group of people with a limited amount of insurrectionary energy, kind of deplorables, managed to do something like this. And so I think that will be the challenge for the Biden administration, will be to say, look, this is all over now. This is this is what's been saved. We've saved you from. Let's essentially move past this and move beyond it, and recover the American brand internationally as well.
Well, I mean, I think, like, as I've argued, and I think several of us have argued in various different media and whatever, that to a certain extent, the kind of liberal centrists need the specter of fascists, or, the kind of insurrectionary Confederate flag waving deplorables and so on, to sustain their authority, because there's very little else backing it up. So, I mean, I obviously on one level think they've kind of maybe have done them a favor. But we'll also need to keep talking it up, because I mean, if this disappears, if this is just the last hurrah of Trumpism, not to say that that's the last hurrah of populism or of any kind of turbulence or disruption to the neoliberal order, far from it. But if this is the last hurrah of this specific form of it, of Trumpism, they'll still need to reinvent some other kind of challenge on the horizon. But I mean the kind of democratic establishment, the kind of the U.S. establishment as a whole, I suppose. but I think we'll probably talk a bit more about that in a bit. But I did want to ask, maybe in more direct reference to what's just happened, to discuss whether there might be a split in the Republican Party in the offing. I mean, do we think that either in formal terms or that maybe just informally, that the kind of Trump rump, for once, the Trump rump, will actually be a kind of cohesive force within or without the Republican Party, which would cause problems to the kind of GOP establishment? Amber?
So I've talked about this and thought about this and considered it before, because we saw a fairly, not really a split, and I don't see that happening specifically because in the two-party system, and they're not real parties, we don't really have splits in American parties for a number of reasons, namely that they're incredibly sclerotic and undemocratic, and the elites in them, at least in the Republican Party, have party discipline, more so certainly than the Democratic Party. But what we do is have these ginger groups internally that sort of shift the party in one direction or another. The Tea Party, which is the most recent successful example of that, ginger group, kind of astroturf, funded from within, sort of a populist image, but not really. I think those were the perfect conditions for something like that to push the Republican Party more, I guess, libertarian, less traditionally conservative, less kind of, the evangelical stuff was sort of wearing off in terms of way, the cultural conservatism was sort of going away. I think to reconsider the project of the Tea Party, not as a pushing further rightward, but as a shifting of priorities to economic right-wing policies, is a better understanding of it, and it was very successful. The problem is the kind of resentment of this. I don't want to call the people at the Capitol the Trump base, but there's certainly a significant and active part of the base that they're all over the place. Their priorities are all over the place.
These guys aren't economically very right wing. I mean, it's that in that regard they're different from the Tea Party, right? I mean, they're not going to be militating in favor of super low taxes or a minimal state or something like that. Yeah,
the Tea Party, petit bourgeoisie, did have a shared, or at least of the allegedly populist wing of it, which is of course funded by Koch brothers, etc. They did have a shared set of material interests. Those people at the Capitol have nothing shared except for exasperation, paranoia, feeling of persecution, hopelessness, and we'll say levels of resentment that are completely unfocused and directed, we'll say irrationally. That's not a good basis for what we call a ginger group, which is, the Tea Party. I don't know what they can do with this. I do know they have a lot of really resentful people. I just don't know what what tent they could put them under together.
I think unsurprisingly, I think Amber's exactly right. And I think this raises important questions about sort of the dislocation of American communal life in the last 20, 30 years. I imagine this was totally organized online. And so when you don't have these sorts of shared literal physical spaces where people are able to come together and to become what might, to borrow an old Marxist term, to become conscious of itself, right, as some type of social force, you get what we got yesterday. Right. I think that in a different era, and when there were real communal organizations where people would go and they would have these social bonds and they would form the nucleus of a potential political movement, which is what I think Amber's right. The Tea Party was, because it represented a real material force in society. All of the people that had yesterday was a sort of vague carnival-esque resentment at the United States, which is why when they got in the Capitol, all they did was they were walking around with selfie sticks and they trashed Pelosi's office. So this is, I think, another reflection of
we're just jealous. I just want to put that out there, the people who are so disgusted by that kind of activity. It's you're just jealous because I wouldn't be doing that with my political project.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea was like it looked like it was fun, and that's actually attractive to people. And that even goes back to the old Nagel argument that she made in Kill All Normies, which is not unrelated to this. But I think it's also just a reflection of the decommunalization of American life. And now all the arguments are taking place about it online, too, because we're all stuck inside during a pandemic. But I just want to underline, we're in a very strange moment.
Yeah, and I'm also like reading a little bit, too much Adorno right now and applying it to everything. But I do think
that's dangerous.
I know. But insofar as I don't agree with some of the stuff about his evaluation of fascism and like the integration of like psychoanalysis and stuff, part of me like is watching them on TV. They're like children. They're like it's very ego driven. But then also there's this realization, much the way the baby one day has to realize that the mother is not just an appendage that he can control. They're like realizing that Trump is not just an appendage that they can control. And that's, I don't know how they're going to deal with that. Like, that is truly unpredictable. It depends more on pandemic stuff. It depends on, how the incoming administration responds to them. Like I said, they do not appear intent on de-escalating them, which I find very troubling. We acknowledge they're fucking crazy people. Please do not antagonize the crazy people. I do think that this kind of activity or sentiment is not over. I don't think this is the final tantrum before they bed down. This energy and resentment is not going anywhere. And I have no idea what's going to happen.
Well, I guess part of that, the generation of that resentment is the risk that, I guess the Republican Party could split to a greater or lesser extent between, I guess, essentially the deplorables on one side and then the Christian evangelicals and the conservatives on the other side. And it's likely, if that does happen, that the former group, so the sort of people who made this riot or this protest or this coup up, will have less influence over the control of the party. Obviously, it depends a lot what happens in 2024 if Trump were to run again. But it seems like that's the potential split that you can have, and that's, I guess, the risk if that constituency isn't represented within the party or isn't able to influence it to the same extent. You'll have that same sort of, I guess, insurrectionary energy.
Yeah, to move things on, I think it's worth restating that the Democrats won the popular vote in the presidential election. They won the Electoral College. They won a majority in the House and now have 50% of the Senate. So we've still been talking about Trump and about the Republicans right at the start. And of course, it's still the thing that's making the headlines, and it's still the Republicans who hold the presidency.
For you.
Huh?
There's a headline for you right now. So Speaker Pelosi, she says she's called for Trump's removal from office. And she says if the Vice President Pence doesn't invoke the 25th Amendment, then House Democrats will pursue impeachment. So again, that'll be impeachment for the second time.
They already did it.
Days. Yeah, I know. Bizarre, huh?
But it was so much fun the first time. Do it again.
Once again, like literally, are they just trying to antagonize the base? Yeah.
It struck me actually that the best way to kind of to defang Trump would be for Biden to give him a pardon, because it would completely remove any kind of mystique or that he enjoys as being an outsider, kind of a representative of the excluded and the marginalized. Nice. And it would entirely fold them into the elite, as well as kind of allowing them, just to kind of pass over this moment. It would completely demolish his legitimacy in the eyes of his followers and supporters. But instead,
and a Nobel Peace Prize as well.
Yes, even better. So kind of full presidential pardon, Nobel Peace Prize, and he goes away. Instead, they're pursuing this kind of idiotic strategy of antagonism, to rally and whip up their base, and it's going to backfire.
They need to do it, though. I think various timescales. Modern liberalism is constituted by first anti-fascism, then anti-communism, then anti-Islamism, and now we're back to anti-PRC and anti-fascism. So literally, I'd say modern liberalism, as it is articulated in the United States, is a product of the 1930s and 1940s. So it literally needs this logic to justify its technocratic governance. Literally, the argument for the modern American state is premised on anti-fascism and anti-communism. So I think it needs to do that. But then there's even more proximate causes, which is that you have people who had spent 4 years whipping up resentment against Trump by calling him the worst thing since Hitler, literally. They need something like this. They need a Reichstag fire, because they can't just have him go out with a total whimper, because that would have the psychic damage of that to themselves, who had been claiming for years and years, built careers, made millions of dollars, raised hundreds of millions of dollars, I imagine, for quixotic campaigns. They need something like this. This is the biggest gift to centrist liberalism that they could have possibly gotten.
Hello, listener. This is Alex here, doing one of those annoying inserts, but I'll try to be quick. I want to let you know about the BungaCast Reading Club. Once a month, we take an important text and analyze it, trying to extract its contemporary relevance and the political lessons for today. We do this with help from our patrons, who send in questions, comments, and their takes on the matter. And we've just set down the reading list for the whole of 2021, and I very quickly want to tell you about it. Coming up this month, we're discussing Richard Tuck's The Left Case for Brexit, looking at arguments for popular sovereignty, in a context in which Brexit has been reduced to behind closed doors negotiations about trade. Then we're reading Deleuze on the Societies of Control, very apt, I think, in the midst of lockdowns. We'll also be looking at Perry Anderson's huge 3-part essay series on the European Union, which is currently being serialized in the London Review of Books. For the rest of 2021, we're reading works by Slavoj Žižek on post-politics, Michael Lind on class war, Eva Illouz's critique of emotional capitalism, Michael Lowy distinguishing Marxism from Romanticism, Elie Zaretsky on psychoanalysis, and Marshall Berman's classic, All That Is Solid Melts Into Air. We think it's a nice mix of long essays with a few books thrown in, so the reading load should never get too heavy. If you'd like to join, we'd of course be delighted to have you. You can sign up now at patreon.com/bungacast. Look forward to seeing you there. Okay, now back to authoritarian liberalism and its discontents.
Well, and additionally, it's interesting to watch the right, or at least this sort of fringe right subculture, imitate the left in terms of its like completely innocuous but totally libidinal protest culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's like, oh, this is now there's a populist resentment among people, among reactionaries, but they are just as incompetent and, believe that the medium is the actual essential thing. It's all, the spontaneity, the protest, the outpouring of emotional, whatever. And I don't know. I could also see, if Republicans don't take advantage of that, these people might also be just as marginalized as the left, because they clearly aren't very good at organizing. Now, also, I mean, we talk about how they need this. Again, like this sounds very paranoid, but they're saying why were we not prepared? I mean, there are multiple politicians giving statements. They're like, it's very surprising that we didn't immediately, have like the National Guard on hand. And it's like, yeah, that is surprising. And when I was going in between Fox News and CNN, Fox News, right up until they were like smashing windows, was covering a lot of the sort of Georgia protests, which is sort of people milling around and, going around in their mobility scooters. And CNN was like, look at what's fucking happening. So it's almost like the right, the right media outlets were just trying to say like, well, look, here's what's going on. Literally there was like a solid, like a very long time when they were just showing like a small crowd outside of, I don't know, the Georgia Capitol. And so it just seems like the right institutions are trying to de-escalate the Trump base so that they can move forward. And, CNN and the other media institutions have a real investment in showing the biggest spectacle possible. Now, I think it got out of hand. I don't think they expected it to get as bad as it did, but I think they wanted a moment that would look good on camera.
So maybe to turn to the more sedate world of the halls of power, well, when they aren't being overrun by guys in horns and looking like bison. I don't know what that was. I think it's a good look personally,
that's just
but
an
not
American
for everybody.
Protest. That guy's at every American protest. They of course immediately found that guy at Black Lives Matter protest too.
Right, and he's an actor apparently, or an aspiring actor.
We're all actors, Alex.
Yeah.
It's America.
This is performing politics. Anyway, so to turn to actually the Democrats' legislative agenda, because obviously Biden ran on not very much of substance. Certainly in terms of the kind of headline messages. But Danny, could you maybe talk us through what you think, at least, what the Dem legislative agenda will be?
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. I've been paying most attention to the foreign policy world, and I just want to briefly, it's going to be more of the same. I imagine Obama.
Well, we can start with foreign policy. Let's start with foreign policy, and then we'll come back to domestic.
Sure. So let's start with foreign policy then. So, if you look at the people who Biden has appointed, people like Blinken and Jake Sullivan and other people, they're basically Obama administration veterans. I'm sure we'll see people like John Favreau and Ben Rhodes in and out of the administration like that. So I think what we're going to see on
give a sense
policy,
of who these people are. Like, what are their roles? Where do they come from? What do they previously do?
So it's a really good question. So Blinken and Sullivan, Blinken was basically Joe Biden's advisor during the Obama administration. Sullivan was associated with Hillary Clinton during the Obama administration. And then we have, who's the other one that I just mentioned? It was another Biden associate. So basically you have like the Biden Clinton team being promoted to the higher positions within the administration. So the big question is, so essentially, like, the structural conditions of American empire are going to remain exactly the same. They're going to have the enormous defense budget. You're going to have the global system of bases. You're going to have the 200,000-ish troops deployed at random places around the world. You're going to have the continuation of the turn to special operations forces and drones for like low footprint military interventions. That all is going to remain the same. I think the biggest question is what's going to happen if you get another sort of Benghazi type situation, because that everyone that Biden has appointed was on the sort of hawkish side of those debates. So there were various debates in the Obama administration. What do you do with Mubarak during the Arab Spring? What do you do with Gaddafi as he threatens Benghazi? And the people who Biden have appointed are essentially younger people who didn't live through, let's say, the second half of the Cold War, and who are bullish on using military force to sort of world make, to make the world in America's image. So the question, though, is that has there been enough of a political change in the last 4 years, or really since Libya, and Obama saying things like Libya was the biggest disaster of his administration, to prevent the type of use of force that we've seen in the past? My guess is that if there's a humanitarian crisis that could be used to justify intervention, people like Blinken are going to be in favor of it. Biden is actually weird because he has different perspectives on this, but I think he's kind of like not all there. And I think it's going to be mostly in his, it's going to be mostly those under him who are going to be making the foreign policy administration. So it's not going to be, I think, a particularly interesting time for critics of foreign policy, because I think we're just going to get more of the same, and what could have been a really transformative administration under Bernie isn't going to get going. In terms of legislation, I think that the sort of win in the Senate raises a whole lot of interesting questions, but I've been rambling along, and I'll let Amber take that up, because I'm curious to see what she thinks the Dem control of the Senate means, if anything.
Well, let's just stick to foreign policy just for a second. I don't know if Amber, you wanted to comment on foreign policy immediately. Because I mean, my question is, I think, or everyone's question is, does this mean more war? Does this mean more war than we've even had than we had under the Trump administration, where, you know, notably didn't really start any new wars? So,
I mean, I think this is a very kind of classic kind of Stalin-y response, but I think foreign policy is determined by domestic policy, so it depends how they manage what little shambles of the state we have. And I would say, like, you know, Danny always at this point like apologizes and prefaces things as like, well, I've been paying attention to foreign policy and not domestic politics lately. And it's like, well, okay, but that's really the only part of America that functions right now, so it kind of does make sense. I mean, when people talk about it as a failing state, it is a failing state insofar as it functions as a state, but it's an increasingly successful empire. So it does make sense to focus on that. But yeah, I can jump more in when we switch to domestic.
Phil.
I mean, I think, yeah, it's an interesting one because, I mean, I think on the one hand, you know, I think they will certainly continue the geopolitical rivalry with China. So that will, that's locked in. And in any case, it began under Obama with the pivot to Asia and all of that. So, I mean, that was already long in the works, and I think the Democrats will continue it. I do think the temptation to have some kind of war, humanitarian intervention, some kind of military display of force, I think will be overwhelming, and that they'll have difficulty resisting it. I'm sure they're chastened by the experiences of Iraq and Libya, in as much as they don't want it to be so kind of, not that they particularly care about human life, but only in as much as they want to avoid the spectacle of it being a disaster. So if they see the possibility for a theatrical win, without having to take any kind of political responsibility for nation building, military occupation, what have you, I think they'll take it. And they need to, I think, in order to, part of the whole thing about America being back, as Biden says, is America throwing its imperial weight around. And so they have to have some kind of show of force in order to differentiate themselves from Trump.
Yeah, my question here is how it's going to be justified, because I guess will it be responsibility to protect or humanitarian grounds? I mean, America throwing its weight around doesn't seem a particularly, probably particularly good way to justify it. Will it just be this is the post-Trump order? America's back. We're sensible this time. We've learned our lessons.
I still think, it's a possibility that they might invade Brazil to stop the Brazilian government like rampaging through the Amazon, and then this will put Alex in an ethical conundrum. Will he try to set up a guerrilla insurgency to fight the gringos, or will he kind of, follow his duty to the planet? So will he defend Brazilian sovereignty and launch a guerrilla war against the American empire? What will he do?
Stay tuned to find out. Yeah.
It'll be a green. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to imagine a green intervention, but, maybe a natural disaster, something like what happened with Cyclone Nargis in Burma in 2008, when Bernard Kouchner, who is, I think, the French foreign minister at the time, was pushing for a military intervention into Burma. I could see a kind of a green-tinged humanitarian intervention, something like that.
I think I just like the idea of Alex, the most unlikely eco-terrorist.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like the episode of Archer. I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah, it's okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll have to leave that for another time.
Going to need a humanitarian precedent. I think, in particular, because the Democrats have spent the entire Trump administration sort of stoking fear and feelings of being under attack, although from to enemies within. I don't even think they'll have to be like, oh no, we have to save the women from female genital mutilation, or we have to save the indigenous people. I think that they could just be like, these people are bad people.
Bringing humanitarian intervention home. I'm being kind of slightly facetious, but that might have a role to play, that both in the eyes of the world and in its own eyes, that the United States might be able to gain that ethical sheen, not through intervention abroad, but by saying that we are fighting off these reprobates at home. So, I mean, I don't know. I wonder whether...
Well, totally. But insofar as I think that we could intervene abroad, I don't even think we would have to argue it on humanitarian grounds. We'd just be like, draw some sort of specious kind of relationship where a bunch of like MAGA people were on a message board or a subreddit, supporting, I don't know, Iran or something. All they would have to do is connect the new enemy with the enemy within, and then they don't even have to argue that there's someone we're doing this to benefit.
And what'll be really interesting with this, because I think you're going to see Biden fulfill the second Obama administration, like pivot to Asia thing that never really got off the ground. But what's interesting about the type of new Cold War stuff is that, unlike the Soviet Union and the United States, I mean, the United States and the PRC are so economically intertwined. So I think you're just going to get this type of shadow war where you're going to see millions of dollars, billions of dollars funneled to essentially pork in the United States to build these pointless weapons and to fund these pointless defense factories. I think you're going to see a lot of that happen. But I think you are going to see intervention abroad. I mean, if you look in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs, Samantha Power has an article titled like something that can do power.
Yeah.
She's basically signaling like the United States is back, and
anti-corruption is going to be a big plank of that. I think following that article, I mean that the U.S. is an ethical power going around, trying to break up whatever clientelist relations that you might have elsewhere, and of course that's useful in targeting both China and Russia. So yeah, I imagine that'll be something that'll emerge in the next couple of years. Let's turn to the domestic agenda because, as we've already said, kind of having a very slim majority in the Senate with the vice president being able to cast a decisive vote there changes things a little bit. Maybe that kind of blue wave did actually manifest in legislative supremacy. So what does that mean? The Democrats are going to actually have to do something now, or?
No, I would say that what their project now will be largely based around justifying their legitimacy, looking busy, that kind of thing. And I think they've got at least 2 years of, like talking about the deplorable still, even with Trump non-novice. They will keep that going. The other thing I would say is that the way that they're going to exercise their power is becoming increasingly managerial rather than legislative. And the example that I would use that I'm extremely disturbed by is the way, for example, Governor Cuomo in New York is managing vaccine rollout. Now, this is not something that's subject to, mass like political coordination and democracy and et cetera. And I can understand that, in an emergency, sometimes, it's like executive power has to be, like, we got to hurry up and get these out here. What he's doing, however, and I think he's very consciously doing it, is creating an entire bureaucracy around the vaccine rollout that is incredibly inefficient and that is highly punitive toward healthcare workers. Now, for example, if someone cuts in line for a vaccine, the hospital is fined. The only place you could administer these vaccines is in a hospital. And if they aren't administering them, or I think if they're Tesla's over, they also get fined. So now Cuomo is in a position where he can, make an image of himself as someone who's trying to roll out the vaccines. Meanwhile, the ineffective public employees at the hospital are getting in the way. They're lazy. They're letting people cheat. There's corruption all around. And of course, there's going to be people are going to jump the line. It's New York. It's full of rich people. He's going to have, while people are panicked too and trying to get the vaccine, he's going to be in a position where he could blame, vaccines going bad on the shelf because they have a very short shelf life. I mean, like, they weren't even, by the way, vaccinating on the weekends for a while. I think he could create a bad situation and then use that to punish what are essentially public employees. Now, that is the kind of brilliant fucking policy of someone with authoritarian political aspirations. Someone who I'm way more concerned about than like Donald Trump. I mean, he came out, by the way, speaking of populist, with a book about how he defeated Corona before the second wave. Like, this is a crazy person, and he knows that he has a hot ticket. And in addition to creating a bad system that can make him look like the good guy cop who's keeping law and order and making sure people get his vaccines, it acts as a disciplining kind of effect for public employees. And I think you're going to see more shit like that. I think he's literally also shifted the process to where he is rolling out like the program for vaccination. I mean, that's insane. He's a governor. Whoever heard of a Italian hospital administrator? Like, there's no reason he should be developing a plan for how to roll out healthcare. I don't know if it should be like the New York chapter of the American Medical Association or what, but he has slowly consolidated consolidated his power and bulked up his responsibilities and increased his authority over what is essentially like a public health program, which he has no expertise in, no nothing. I think you're going to see a lot of people sort of making grabs in the desperation to increase their power and authority. And I think Corona has provided an amazing opportunity for that. Because people are poor, they want the vaccine, they're panicking, and they don't know what to do.
And I just want to very quickly just add on to what Amber says and highlight how this rhymes with what I was just talking about the need of some external crisis or some external enemy to increase centralized power in an executive or in some sort of using some sort of technocratic means to increase centralized power, which is a theme that we've seen in American history over the last 150 years, over the last 70, and then really over the last 30. So you could see how these similar logics are operating in different spheres.
And I think a year ago, I was like, well, look, a Biden presidency is going to be like technocratic tinkering and, like Kamala's education bill, where it's like you can have 10% of your loans forgiven if you have, if you started a small business and were a first generation college attendee and received Pell. Like, I was like, they're going to do weird, arcane shit like that no one can navigate. Now, I don't even think they need to do that. Now they can, when people are like, well, what are the Democrats doing? They're like, we're managing a crisis. I don't think legislation will even be necessary.
And the economic crisis, which will continue, I mean, well beyond after vaccination is done, and, hopefully that's sooner rather than later. But there's still enough crisis out there for them to manage.
Yeah.
And just very quickly, this is particularly a problem in America where so much governance gets done in like apolitical bureaucratic institutions that make rules. So it's actually very easy to like point to this and just make new rules that have no democratic legitimacy.
So, I mean, if they do try to pass anything, I mean, of any substance, or do you think that Republicans are going to be obstructive? Are they going to try to be? Do they have the capacity to be? And maybe also as a kind of follow-on from that, pick up whichever question you prefer. What is the role of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party? I mean, I think notably they haven't managed to extract any sort of concessions because they seem not to understand how power works. But that notwithstanding, do they play a role? Do they play an ideological role within the Democratic administration, or if not inside the administration, at least within American formal politics?
They play the role of the patsy.
Right. Yeah, that's
I also don't even think it's like an absence of strategy. But the truth of the matter is that the so-called left wing of the Democratic Party is like 5 people.
Yeah.
And they have no power. I mean, they exist literally as an alibi. They are allowed to stay in office essentially either because no one notices they're there, or because they provide an alibi for the party at large that's like, well, look, no, that like this person got elected.
Good things are happening.
Meanwhile, they keep their numbers down to the point where they couldn't possibly exercise any influence. I mean, we just don't have the influence, and that's how the party was built. And like I'm not kidding. There are really only 5 of them, and in 2 years, there will probably be only 3, and the other 2, I won't say who they will, but they'll be like, cutting the ribbons on new, like, brave girl feminist statues on Wall Street.
Yeah, exactly right.
So, I mean, with that in mind, and the fact that the Biden administration, Biden didn't really run on anything, and the Biden administration, following what Amber and Daniel have said, won't really need to do anything. They can just manage crisis and not really have any legislative agenda to pass. With that in mind, what can the Biden administration be held to account for? What should they be held to account for? And will they be held to account for anything? And by whom, obviously, and by whom? Because obviously it could be mainstream Republicans, it could be far-right Republicans, it could be the left, whatever.
Well, I just want to say, I mean, it's really interesting. I think you see a lot of people on the left side of the spectrum, myself included, kind of rethinking what they're going to do in the wake of the Bernie loss. And I think there's this rethinking because I don't think we have very much power to do anything. And so in some sense, I think the Biden administration is going to have the ability to essentially do whatever it wants. It's going to have almost no one to hold them accountable. And it's going to be a continuation of status quo policies. I don't see how that is going to change in the medium or long term. So I'm just incredibly pessimistic about the whole political project of the left, at least right now. I'm not saying that it's doomed forever, and I'm not saying people should stop working, but I definitely think for the next 4 to 8 years, unless there's some sort of exogenous change, I don't see the left in particular, which is what I care about, having any ability to hold Biden to account to anything.
Yeah, I mean, what about even on the right? Because, I imagine the vast swathes of the media are signed up to supporting the Democratic establishment. And in terms of, I mean, other than like sort of Fox News or even these new outlets to the right of Fox News, beyond that, is there any kind of poll in American society, whether in the media and in other institutions, amongst the populace at large, which will try to hold the Biden administration to account? Or is this just Uncle Joe totalitarianism the whole way?
No, I mean, he's 100% accountable to, capital and, the relationships he's had to the insurance industry and the pharmaceutical industry. And no, Joe Biden is a friend of the fire economy.
But he will be friendly with it. But that's the point, is he will be friendly with them. There's no antagonistic holding to account from any other poll in society. I mean, other than maybe, Fox News will say bad things about Biden, but beyond that kind of demographic and the people who subscribe to those views, it probably doesn't have that much repercussion, right?
Sure, but I'm just saying that, like, the idea of, like, Joe totalitarianism is is a bit. It's, I mean, yeah, he's a willing servant to those people, but like very willing to the point where like get the impression he's never felt coerced. I mean, they would, whatever, break his legs if he tried to buck, but he doesn't want to. But I remember my co-host once pointed out how little success or benefit Joe has received from essentially being, just the lapdog of capital. And he's like, you know what? Like, Joe really just isn't in it for the love of the game. Like, he'll do it for a free cup of coffee. Yeah.
Cup of Joe for Joe.
There you go.
That's enough.
There's nothing coercive. There's no antagonism. He's friendly with them and he's accountable to them. But boy, he loves showing up for work in the morning.
Yeah, Joe doesn't strike me as someone who has a very serious will to power in a real sense. And this is what actually makes his appointments probably the most important thing of his administration. Similar to Reagan or someone like that, someone who is a sort of good at being a glad-handing politician, who, as Amber said, like, loved the game for some reason, loves being a politician, but who doesn't have any particularly strong political program that's not just whatever the party says at the time. So I think that's going to be, I think he actually does have foreign policy views. So he might take some role there. But I think that it's going to be interesting because I think there's going to be a lot of different sort of governments within the Biden administration, and it's going to be very different. And whether there's a coherent strategy is, I think, not going to be. I don't think there will be a coherent strategy, essentially.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe just to sort of wrap this up, because you got Joe totalitarianism. I don't think we can run with that. Uncle Joe. We'll workshop this and we'll come back to you. I was going to ask this question, what next for the left? But then Phil was like, "Oh, don't fucking ask that. That's a terrible question." And it is a terrible question. But I guess not in the sense of like what should the left do, but I mean, is the left entirely wedded now to the Democratic Party with little say and completely despondent? Is it back to kind of where it was in 2014, let's say? Or is there any indication of kind of breaking with the Democratic Party in any way?
Just to clarify, I mean, the reason I think these questions are problematic is generally because I think they, it plays into the fantasy that the left has somewhere to go, whereas surely, given the way in which the left has been completely outmaneuvered and excluded from any kind of meaningful influence and power in the Biden team, surely it's time to kind of say there's nowhere to go.
Make content. Now is the time for content.
I mean, I would say I'd rather be a socialist under, and I've told the story a million times, but basically what happened during, Bush is that people on the left became anti-Bush, and it sucked all the air out of the room. And magazines like The Nation, which used to have at least the vestiges of a working class or at least class-oriented left-wing politics, just became the anti-Bush thing. And that's what you saw happen with Trump to some degree. And there were some people who had been moved left by the Bernie campaign that didn't go back to, but that's a very minority group of people. So in some ways, I think we are better off under Biden. However, I think the country is going to continue a slow, steady slide, and it's not sliding up. I will say I am concerned about the degree of authoritarianism that they're going to attempt to justify. I will say that I'm very concerned that even legislation won't even be there. They can sit on their ass and not show anything. They don't even have to do those little technocratic tweaks just because they could say we're managing a crisis here. That resentment from the Trump base or the electrified Trump base is not going anywhere. And I don't know, it could go either way. I think it's easier for leftists or socialists to have conversations about the shortcomings of the party when the party is in charge, because it's look what they're doing or what they're not doing. But having those conversations is, only part of it. Getting people on your side is only part of it. What we should be doing is building institutions and, the labor movement. I don't see that happening. Plus, people are fucking tired after 4 years of this shit. They're just exhausted.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's of all the bad scenarios, the worst one, I think, it seems, is just depoliticization and further withdrawal from politics as people are exhausted from culture wars. So that's kind of a fairly grim prognosis. But yeah, I guess that's what we're looking at. We're looking at kind of, at least, I don't know about the bit that I've just said, but I mean, in terms of what the US government will look like, permanent crisis management, at least for the next 2 years, and maybe some dabbling in humanitarian intervention abroad. That seems like a pretty grim picture especially for a government headed by someone who's just saved the free world, supposedly.
I think that's why, Alex, exactly for that reason, I think that's why you're seeing the left essentially like go crazy, at least online, which is my only interaction with the left at this moment right now.
That's their only interaction with the world. So
right. So I think you're having this, like, people are losing their minds. They don't know what to do. And I think this is reflected to, call it back to the coup conversations that are having now, and the sort of this fevered need to identify things as the absolute worst thing humanly possible, when in my opinion, they're very patently not. You need to have that in some sort of, fulfill some sort of psychic function.
I guess to finish this on a positive note, it does mean that the rest of us, all those of us who are not those 300 million US Americans, can go back to focusing on our own affairs and stop participating in the US circus. So that's good. We'll let them get on with their things. Thank you very much, Amber and Daniel. You get on with sorting out America. Good luck with that. You have our full support, but we've also got other things to be getting on with. That's it for now. Catch you later. Bye-bye.